Hey guys. Tonight we drift back in time, to the candlelit world of the Tudors. A world of lace, lies, and quiet rebellion. Our story is called When Tudor Women Broke Every Rule of Decency, and more. It's a tale of queens who performed virtue like theater, and ordinary women who rewrote history with nothing but wit and whispered defiance. So wherever you're listening from, maybe tucked in bed, or winding down after a long day, let your thoughts slow down. Breathe deep. And let history do the dreaming tonight. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, don't forget to hit the bell icon and subscribe, so you'll never miss another sleepy story from the past. Now, let's dim the lights and step softly into the Tudor age. The year was 1553, and the night pressed close against the windows of Whitehall Palace. The river outside was dark as ink, and within the chambers of the royal court, everything shimmered in candlelight, gold thread on velvet, glass beads on gowns, polished shoes that never touched a speck of dirt. It was said that a Tudor lady could be measured by the rustle of her skirts. The quieter the sound, the greater her grace. To be a proper woman in Tudor England was to exist like a painting, still, beautiful, and silent. A fluttering fan could speak more than words, a lowered gaze could mean obedience, and modesty was considered a greater treasure than wit. The court expected perfection, a careful balance between charm and chastity, elegance and invisibility. Young girls learned early that their worth was in restraint. Mothers whispered it as they brushed their daughters' hair. Sit straight. Speak softly. Smile when spoken to. Never reach before you are offered. The music of the Tudor court was a quiet symphony of compliance. And yet, the air was thick with contradiction. Because the very men who preached virtue craved intrigue. Courtiers traded gossip like coin, and the queen's ladies learned that silence could be weaponized, that a smile, well-timed, could turn rumor into advantage. Decency, in truth, was a fragile veil stretched over a restless society. In this candlelit world, the difference between purity and scandal was often only a rumor away. One misinterpreted glance could cost a woman her position. One whispered letter could end a life. But under the lace and linen, some women began to ask dangerous questions. What if obedience was not the only form of survival? What if decency could be rewritten? They began, quietly, to test the limits. A bolder color on the sleeve. A jest made in mixed company. A decision made without a man's permission. Small rebellions, as gentle as the flicker of a candle, but each one left its trace of smoke. The men at court often dismissed it as feminine folly. They didn't notice how those tiny acts of defiance began to ripple outward. By the late 1530s, there were women who read forbidden books, women who managed estates better than their brothers, women who learned to write poetry that hinted, slyly, at passion and intellect beyond what proper ladies were supposed to possess. Behind the tapestries, women were talking. Not just about embroidery or gowns, but about ideas, about love, power, religion, and the strange freedom that came with knowing how fragile all the rules really were. It was said that to live as a Tudor woman was to walk on a blade. Yet there were those who danced upon it. As night deepened in the royal apartments, a faint melody drifted from the musicians' gallery. A lute, a sigh of laughter, then silence again. Somewhere, a young lady of the court was being measured for a gown that would scandalize half of London. Another was composing a letter that would make or break a kingdom. And one, the boldest of all, was about to turn her charm into rebellion. Anne Boleyn entered the English court not like a storm, but like a candle, quiet, alluring, and impossible to ignore. She was no ordinary lady-in-waiting. She had learned the arts of conversation, flirtation, and French courtliness during her years abroad. When she spoke, her words glided rather than struck. When she moved, the air seemed to part for her. The Tudor court was accustomed to beauty, but Anne's power came from something rarer, wit. Men of rank found themselves leaning forward to catch her every phrase, and women whispered her name with admiration and warning alike. The king noticed. At first, Anne's charm was harmless, almost expected. The King of England was known for his wandering eye, and everyone assumed she would follow the familiar path: a brief affair, a quiet departure, a small pension, a polite forgetfulness. But Anne refused to be forgotten. She would not become another name in the king's ledger of mistresses. She held herself with the dignity of a queen long before she wore a crown. And in doing so, she shattered the unspoken law that a woman's ambition must hide behind her beauty. Whispers grew thick as fog. Some called her a witch, others a saint. She wore black velvet when others favored color, a bold choice, daring, almost funereal. She spoke to the king as an equal, teasing him, questioning him, guiding him. It was indecent, they said, for a woman to speak to a monarch with such confidence. But Anne had discovered the secret that many Tudor women would come to realize: decency was a costume, and costumes could be changed. Every gesture was a calculation. Each refusal, a move in a dangerous game that would change England forever. And as Anne's influence deepened, women across the realm began to take note. The rules that governed their lives suddenly seemed less immutable. If a woman could unmake a queen and crown herself, what else might be possible? But the same flames that illuminated her also consumed her. By the time her coronation feast ended, enemies had already begun to weave her downfall. The price of breaking the rules, Anne would learn, was steep, and sometimes paid in blood. Yet her legacy would not end at the scaffold. It would linger in every whispered act of female defiance that followed. In Tudor England, fashion was not merely a matter of taste. It was a declaration of rank, loyalty, and sometimes quiet rebellion. Every ruffle, every stitch, every shade of silk carried meaning. To dress above one's station was not just scandalous, it was illegal. The sumptuary laws dictated what a woman could wear according to her birth. Scarlet velvet was reserved for the nobility. For trims of ermine were for the elite. But for women who had learned from Anne Boleyn's daring, the laws were only threads waiting to be tugged. The courtiers whispered about a new kind of fashion, one that spoke in code. A lady might appear modest in cut, yet the color of her gown might blaze with suggestion. A demure bodice might conceal a heart stitched in gold beneath the lining. The queen's tailors, harried and overworked, were sometimes sworn to silence, for what they fitted could ruin reputations. Silk merchants from Antwerp grew rich supplying secret shades, the deep blue that only royalty was supposed to wear, or the crimson that made the king's advisers frown. To the outside world, these were trifles. To Tudor women, they were acts of quiet defiance, declarations that they saw through the boundaries that men had written for them. The greatest danger came not from the fabric, but from the eyes that watched it. A lady's choice of dress could be read like a confession. A too bright hue might hint at vanity, or worse, ambition. Yet ambition was precisely what many women were learning to cultivate, even if they had to hide it under layers of lace. At court banquets, the queen's ladies became moving tapestries. Jewels glimmered like coded messages. A sapphire brooch might signal loyalty to one faction, a pendant cross to another. Even the embroidery on a sleeve could whisper allegiance or betrayal. The wardrobe became a battlefield. Among the most daring of these sartorial insurgents was Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife. Learned, composed, and quietly rebellious, she wore her intelligence as elegantly as her gowns. Catherine encouraged scholars, published books in her own name, and dressed in a manner that reflected her authority, understated but commanding. Her style told the world that dignity need not mean silence. Elsewhere, far from court, even merchants' wives began to imitate the nobility. Tailors in London and Bristol worked long nights creating gowns that blurred the line between the permitted and the forbidden. The king's officers raided shops, confiscating contraband velvet and foreign lace. But rebellion, once stitched into the fabric of society, cannot be unstitched so easily. The Tudor woman's wardrobe was a manifesto in silk and pearl. Behind every delicate hem was a whisper of independence. Behind every jeweled clasp, the glint of resistance. But clothing could not hide everything. The same women who dared to wear forbidden fabrics soon learned that real power lay not only in appearance, but in the words exchanged in shadowed corridors, the secret letters, the whispered promises, the quiet manipulation of politics. The gowns shimmered by candlelight, yes. But behind them, sharper ambitions gleamed. And so, as one fashion faded and another rose, the court's silken conspirators began their next rebellion, not of color or cloth, but of conversation. The tapestry rooms of Whitehall and Hampton Court were thick with scent, beeswax, rosewater, and something subtler, intrigue. Here, amid the soft shuffle of skirts and murmured prayers, the real politics of the Tudor age often unfolded. Men believed themselves to be the architects of power. But women knew the walls had ears, and they learned to make them listen. A lady-in-waiting might appear to be pouring wine or offering embroidery advice, yet in those delicate motions, entire kingdoms shifted. A misplaced word, a sigh, a question about the Queen's health, all could be weaponized. Information was the true currency of court life, and women were its most skilled traders. The corridors behind the throne rooms were lined with woven tapestries, vast scenes of hunts and myths. But they also served a purpose, to muffle voices. Behind those heavy fabrics, secrets moved like perfume, impossible to contain. Letters were slipped through folded fans, messages sewn into sleeves. Even servants became part of this invisible web, carrying rumors as deftly as they carried silver trays. One such master of whispered politics was Jane Dormer, lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary I. Jane's loyalty was legendary, but so was her subtlety. She could read the court like scripture, deciphering who stood where, who smiled too brightly, and who was about to fall from favor. When Mary rose to power, it was Jane's quiet counsel that steadied her through storms of rebellion. No law had ever written that women could wield power and counsel. Yet Jane did, and so did many others, cloaked in courtesy. In parlors and privy chambers, alliances were forged not with swords, but with lace and laughter. One noblewoman might charm an ambassador while another distracted a rival with gossip. To the casual observer, it was all idle talk. To those who understood, it was diplomacy of the highest order. And behind it all, the tapestries quivered with every secret shared. The great irony of Tudor politics was that while men sat in council chambers debating laws, women decided which words reached their ears. A letter intercepted here, a favor whispered there, and entire fates changed course. For the women of Tudor England, breaking the rules of decency was often the only way to survive them. But sometimes, the games turned personal. The same skills that shaped kingdoms could also undo hearts. In the glittering whirl of politics and perfume, one kind of rebellion began to rise above all others: romantic defiance. For if politics were power, then love, forbidden and perilous, was its shadow. There were few sights more unsettling to a Tudor moralist than a woman smiling too soon after her husband's death. Mourning, after all, was not merely an emotion, it was a performance. A widow was expected to dress in black for at least a year, her face hidden beneath a veil, her laughter muted, her desires buried with the body of her spouse. But in the uncertain world of 16th-century England, where plague, childbirth, and politics claimed lives with relentless rhythm, death came far too often for grief to follow every rule. And some women, having tasted the brittle edges of widowhood, discovered something their husbands had never intended them to have: freedom. They inherited estates, incomes, and choices. And with choices came suspicion. A widow who remarried quickly was whispered about in every corner of London. Was it greed? Lust? Or something far more daring, independence? One such story belonged to Catherine Parr, the last of Henry VIII's 6 wives. She had outlived the most dangerous man in England, a feat that could have earned her sainthood in any other age. Yet scarcely a year after Henry's death, she married again, for love, not for politics. Her new husband, Thomas Seymour, was handsome, reckless, and entirely unsuited for discretion. The court was scandalized. "A queen dowager!" they gasped, lowering herself for passion. But Catherine had endured enough of duty. She wanted life, warmth, and laughter before time's scythe found her again. Her choice defied every Tudor rule of decency. A queen was supposed to remain veiled in eternal mourning, a monument to chastity and sorrow. Instead, Catherine remarried in secret, smiled in public, and let the whispers wash over her like wind on silk. Her rebellion was quiet but monumental. It said, "A woman may choose again." And she was not alone. Across the kingdom, widows of merchants, sailors, and minor gentry were doing the same. Some remarried for security. The economy was cruel to women alone, but others did it for the thrill of choosing without permission. For the first time, they were the ones writing the contracts, setting the terms, deciding whom to share their hearth with. Of course, society struck back. Ballads were written mocking merry widows. Preachers scolded from pulpits about women who could not keep their modesty in mourning. But no sermon could unteach what those women had learned, that grief was not a cage unless you let it close. In small parish records, you can trace their defiance in ink. A widow remarries after 8 months instead of 12. Another refuses to take her husband's name again. A third insists her children inherit equally, even if the law says otherwise. Tiny rebellions, each one barely a sentence in history's ledger, yet together, they form a chorus of resilience. The moralists called them indecent. History remembers them as alive. But love, for a Tudor woman, was a dangerous game. And in the same shadows where widows found freedom, others hid their secrets in ink, letters, diaries, and coded confessions that could cost them everything. When a Tudor woman wished to speak freely, she rarely did so aloud. The walls had ears, the servants had tongues, and letters, fragile, folded, and sealed in wax, became the safest place to hide a dangerous thought. Women of the court learned the art of coded writing. They disguised love letters as pious reflections, political warnings as household instructions. Some used invisible ink made from lemon juice, others employed secret alphabets known only to trusted friends. It was, in its own way, the birth of a female underground, a quiet, ink-stained rebellion. A letter from Lady Elizabeth, long before she became queen, shows how carefully these codes were spun. She wrote to her half-sister, Queen Mary, pleading loyalty, yet every line could be read 2 ways, one submission, one survival. Historians still debate which voice was the true one. That was Elizabeth's genius. Her words obeyed while her meaning disobeyed. But it wasn't only royalty. Women in towns and manors kept journals filled with thoughts they could never speak aloud. In those pages, they questioned marriage, faith, desire, and destiny. They wrote of the loneliness of childbearing, the absurdity of court etiquette, the hypocrisy of men who demanded purity but offered none. Most of those diaries have been lost to time, burned, hidden, or used to wrap spices centuries later. But sometimes one survives, and when you read it, it's like hearing a whisper through 500 years. One such diary, found in an old chest in Norfolk, belonged to a woman named Marjorie Bruce. She wrote to her beloved, John Potton, letters so tender that even in the restrained language of the era, her passion is unmistakable. "My heart me longeth sore for you," she wrote, the kind of confession that, in a world of arranged marriages, was almost indecent. But indecency, as Tudor women were discovering, was often just honesty in disguise. Even Queen Catherine Parr, scholar and widow, published her own writings, religious meditations at first, then something far bolder, a book that argued for women's right to interpret scripture themselves. In the 1540s, that was nearly heresy. The king's advisers watched her closely. Yet she persisted, pen in hand, faith unshaken, decency redefined. Ink was freedom, and danger. Many women paid dearly for what they wrote. A misplaced letter could lead to interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. But still they wrote, because silence had become unbearable. In the candlelit corners of Tudor England, the scratching of quills was the sound of rebellion, soft, rhythmic, relentless. And as those secret words spread from chamber to chamber, something new began to emerge among Tudor women, not just courage, but connection. Through letters, they found one another, and themselves. Yet for all their cleverness, one truth remained: every secret had a heartbeat. And sometimes the walls whispered back. Decency, in Tudor England, was a tightrope stretched over the abyss of gossip. A woman could live her whole life balancing perfectly upon it, until one careless word, one daring laugh, sent her tumbling. The court, ever hungry for scandal, needed only the faintest tremor to turn admiration into accusation. At the center of this fragile dance was Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII. She was barely more than a girl when she arrived at court, all bright eyes and quick laughter. For a brief season, she dazzled the king, and horrified his advisers. The old courtiers muttered that she smiled too easily, that her gowns were too playful, her glances too free. They were right to worry. In a world built on surveillance, joy itself could be a crime. Catherine's story began like a song and ended like a dirge. Her charm, her youth, her boldness, all the qualities that first drew the king's attention, soon became the instruments of her undoing. She was accused of infidelity, and though the truth remains tangled in centuries of rumor, her fate was sealed long before the axe fell. Her final words were not of denial, but regret for trusting the wrong people, for living too brightly in a court that preferred its women dim. Her tragedy became a warning whispered in every dressing chamber: smile softly, but never too wide. But despite the fear, women continued to test the line. They learned that power could be hidden inside politeness. A lady might feign ignorance while guiding a conversation toward her own ends. She might flatter a man into believing her helpless, then use his confidence as a shield. The trick was to seem innocent while being anything but. Behind fans and folded letters, flirtation became negotiation. A glance could secure an alliance. A dance could open a door that 100 petitions never would. Men wrote the rules, yes, but women learned to choreograph around them. Not every story ended in tragedy. Some women became legends for the very daring that once threatened to ruin them. The courtesan Bess of Hardwick, for instance, turned scandal into fortune. She married 4 times, each union richer and more strategic than the last, and ended her life one of the wealthiest women in England. Indecent, some whispered. Indispensable, others admitted. It was through women like Bess that Tudor England discovered a new kind of female ambition, practical, unrepentant, and quietly revolutionary. They did not apologize for wanting more. They did not bow to the ghost of shame that haunted their ancestors. Still, even for the cleverest, the air at court was perilously thin. One wrong breath could still destroy them. So they learned to move softly, like smoke, filling the spaces between the rules without ever appearing to break them. But while some women fought their battles in the halls of power, others wrestled with something even more intimate: the struggle between the desires of the body and the dictates of the soul. And that is where our next story begins. In the chapel's dim light, where confession met temptation. In the Tudor world, religion was not simply a matter of faith. It was the air everyone breathed, the language of life itself. Yet beneath its solemn hymns beat another rhythm, the pulse of human longing. To be a devout woman was to live in constant negotiation with that pulse. The Church told her that virtue meant silence, submission, and purity, but the world around her shimmered with temptation. The court's chapels smelled of incense and rosewater, eyes met across pews, prayers and desires tangled like vines around a crucifix. Confessionals filled with secrets. A lady might kneel before her priest, confessing the sin of vanity, yet her voice would tremble for reasons unspoken. She might describe the indulgence of a silk gown, but both knew that what she really mourned was a fleeting touch or thought. And sometimes, even the priest trembled too. Faith was supposed to purify desire. But in the Tudor court, the two often danced together, inseparable, intoxicating. When an Askew, a noble woman of sharp mind and fierce conviction, dared to interpret the Bible herself, the authorities called it heresy. Yet her writings reveal something deeper, a spiritual intimacy that bordered on sensuality. Her love for God was expressed in the same language others reserved for lovers. It was the same fire, differently named. In convents and country manners alike, women used prayer to express what society forbade them to feel. Their psalms became poetry. Their hymns, coded letters to heaven. Even Queen Elizabeth, famously married to her kingdom, was not immune to this duality. She wielded chastity as political armor but used flirtation as diplomacy. Men called her the Virgin Queen. Yet every gesture of hers carried the subtle thrill of withheld affection, the kind that made devotion itself seductive. To be both holy and human was the Tudor woman's impossible calling. She lived between altar and mirror, torn between saving her soul and savoring her life. But many found peace in the tension. They began to see piety not as suppression, but as transformation, the art of turning passion into purpose. Their prayers became poetry, their restraint, a different kind of rebellion. Still, not every heart could bear the strain. For some, faith offered no refuge, only exile. Those women, cast out for sins of passion or pride, would discover another truth. Sometimes, losing one's place in court meant gaining one's freedom. Exile, in Tudor England, was not always a journey of miles. Sometimes, it was only a few steps beyond the threshold of the court. One moment, a woman was draped in velvet and perfume. The next, she was left in silence, her name fading from the murmured lists of invitations. To fall from grace was to become invisible. But invisibility could be a strange kind of freedom. Take the story of Mary Shelton, once a favored lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne Boleyn. She wrote poetry, laughed too freely, and dared to fall in love without permission. Her verses, playful yet sharp, survived the centuries, tucked between the lines of the Devonshire manuscript, where courtly women scribbled sonnets in secret. Mary's pen became her weapon. When she was dismissed from court, she did not beg for return. She wrote instead, transforming her exile into a quiet kind of immortality. Many others followed that path, women who had slipped, in one way or another, through the cracks of propriety. Some found themselves sent to rural estates, far from the flicker of candlelit corridors. There, amid the rustle of linen and the moan of wind through orchards, they discovered something the court could never give: stillness. Stillness to think. Stillness to breathe. Stillness to be. In exile, they shed their masks. No longer forced to play at perfection, they became whole, unguarded, unashamed. They read forbidden books, whispered to the moon, experimented with herbs, wrote letters to lovers long gone. A few even became midwives and healers, tending to those whom polite society ignored. Among them was Marjorie Wentworth, grandmother to Jane Seymour, who raised her daughters not as obedient ornaments but as educated women, sharp-tongued, literate, quietly bold. Her influence would ripple through generations, shaping queens who dared to think beyond obedience. These women, poets, widows, wanderers, did not appear in royal portraits. They left no grand tombs or gilded epitaphs. Yet their lives stitched the unseen fabric of Tudor resilience. They were the ones who survived scandal not by erasing it, but by rewriting it. Exile taught them that rules could be reimagined. That obedience could be a performance. That silence could speak louder than confession. In their solitude, they began to shape the early contours of something the Tudor world did not yet have a word for: individuality. The right to one's own thoughts. The right to one's own story. And stories, once whispered, have a way of traveling. By the late Tudor years, the echoes of those outcast daughters reached the ears of young women who refused to sit quietly at the edges of history. They wanted more, not in defiance of tradition, but in dialogue with it. And so, as the old order faded and the Elizabethan age dawned, the women of England began to carve their own names, not into royal decrees, but into the collective imagination. They were poets, playwrights, and painters. And one of them would dare to do something no woman before her had done, to write her own heart into a play. It began in the quietest corners of London's taverns and printing houses, where ink-stained hands and paper smelled faintly of oak smoke. A woman, cloaked in anonymity, began to write. Her words were not meant to flatter kings or record decrees. They were meant to breathe. The Tudor age had given birth to the English Renaissance, a time when the stage became the beating heart of imagination. Yet women were forbidden to perform, forbidden to publish, forbidden to own their words. Still, they found ways. Mary Sidney, sister to the famed poet Philip Sidney, transformed her home into a salon of learning. There, under candlelight, she translated psalms, wrote poetry, and gathered thinkers like bees to honey. Her pen moved with quiet defiance, gilded in intellect and devotion. She proved that the mind of a woman could be as vast and eloquent as any man's, even in a world determined to pretend otherwise. Then there was Elizabeth Cary, who dared to publish the tragedy of Miriam in 1613, the first play written and printed by an Englishwoman. It was a story of a wife accused, her virtue questioned, her loyalty doubted, themes that mirrored the lives of countless Tudor women before her. Through Miriam's voice, Cary gave form to centuries of silence. And though Elizabeth Cary belonged more to the twilight of the Tudor era, her courage was born in its storms. The women who had suffered under Henry's gaze, who had whispered in Anne's chambers, who had hidden poetry in prayer books, all of them spoke through her quill. For centuries, history had treated women as its scenery. Now, they began to write themselves into its script. Each word was a rebellion. Each line, a reclamation. And somewhere, in a small room overlooking the Thames, a young maidservant might have heard the rumor that women were writing plays now, and felt her heart lift like a curtain in the wind. Because rebellion, even the quiet kind, is contagious. But as pens moved and ideas spread, something else began to shift, something subtler, yet just as radical. Fashion, that mirror of morality, started to tell its own story. Clothes, in Tudor England, were not just garments. They were arguments stitched in thread, declarations whispered in silk, and prayers disguised as pleats. Every ruffle, every ribbon carried meaning, the unspoken grammar of power and desire. A woman's gown could proclaim her virtue or advertise her ambition. The weight of her sleeves, the height of her collar, the glimmer of her jewels, all of it spoke before she ever opened her mouth. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what: gold for the noble, velvet for the privileged, and plain wool for the rest. But rules, as always, tempted rebellion. And no one understood the quiet art of rebellion better than Tudor women. At court, color was everything. Scarlet meant proximity to the throne, black suggested mourning, but also authority. The Queen herself, Elizabeth, made an empire out of image. Her dresses gleamed with pearls, symbols of chastity, while her faces were painted pale as moonlight, untouchable and divine. Her wardrobe became her weapon. She wore virginity as armor and extravagance as strategy. Yet, while the Queen's clothing expressed control, other women used fashion to express resistance. A widow might refuse to wear mourning black, choosing lavender instead, a shade between life and loss. A lady dismissed from court might dye her gown a forbidden crimson, as if to say, "You can take my place, but not my flame." And then there were the hidden symbols. Secret lovers wore matching embroidery patterns, their messages woven where only they would notice: a daisy for faithfulness, a pomegranate for fertility, a swallow for return. In an age where love letters could condemn you, thread became safer than ink. Even the corset, that instrument of control, was subverted. Women learned to shape it to their will, tightening it not just for beauty, but for posture, for strength, for the illusion of immovable grace. The whalebone cage, meant to restrict, became a reminder that even confinement could be worn with elegance. Fashion became a silent language of defiance, one that men could not fully read. For all their laws and lectures, they could not decipher the hidden code of lace and linen. A single brooch out of place could mean rebellion. A loosened ribbon could whisper freedom. And sometimes, the mere act of dressing beautifully in a world that preferred women small and obedient was the boldest act of all. By the late 16th century, London's tailors and seamstresses were quietly shaping a revolution of their own. Beneath the Queen's grandeur, a humbler world of women was threading, cutting, creating, workers who stitched stories into fabric, their callous fingers building the illusion of grace. They, too, had learned the truth that fashion concealed. That beauty, once declared, could not easily be silenced. And as the years rolled forward, as wigs grew taller and lace more elaborate, one question lingered in every chamber mirror. How much of what we wear hides us, and how much reveals us? But fashion was only one mask among many. The Tudors were masters of disguise, not just in dress, but in demeanor, in ritual, in the theater of power itself. And so, the story moves next into that most dangerous and dazzling stage of all, the world of courtly performance, where every gesture could crown you, or condemn you. Imagine a hall glittering with candlelight. Music hums through the air, lutes, flutes, the gentle thrum of strings. The Queen sits elevated, her gown shimmering like frost, her expression unreadable. Around her, nobles move as if choreographed by invisible threads. Every smile, every bow, every step is part of the performance. This was the Tudor masque, a blend of theater, ritual, and diplomacy. But beneath the gilded surface, it was something more dangerous, a battlefield of gestures. To curtsy too deeply was to appear desperate. To curtsy too little was to invite ruin. To laugh at the wrong joke could end a career. Women, especially, were expected to master this impossible choreography. They learned to converse in tones that revealed nothing, to flatter without yielding, to dance without stumbling into scandal. Their entire lives became a masquerade, one that demanded perfect timing and absolute self-control. Yet, paradoxically, these performances gave women power. If they played the part well enough, they could influence decisions that shaped the kingdom. Behind the delicate facade of laughter and lace, real politics unfolded. Letters were exchanged under fans. Secrets were traded between dances. Marriages were negotiated over cups of spiced wine. It was said that Elizabeth herself could read a room better than any spy. Her eyes missed nothing, the tilt of a chin, the flicker of envy, the tremor of fear. She turned observation into a weapon. Those who could mirror her composure thrived, those who cracked beneath the pressure vanished into the quiet oblivion of forgotten courtiers. To survive at court was to act. To turn one's life into theater, and one's face into a mask. But every performance has a breaking point. And for some Tudor women, the mask grew too heavy to bear. Beneath the painted smiles and perfumed hair, a new hunger stirred, not just for love or favor, but for authenticity. They began to crave a life that did not require applause. And so, when the curtain of the 16th century finally began to fall, and the echo of the lute faded into memory, some women quietly walked off the stage, choosing truth over spectacle. What they found, beyond the candlelight of court, was something the Tudors never could control. A private life, unchoreographed and unscripted. When the banquets ended, when courtiers drifted away and the last lute string quieted, Tudor women finally had a few stolen moments to themselves. And in those hours, between midnight and dawn, between duty and dream, they began to write. In letters. In journals. In secret books hidden under beds and beneath floorboards. This is where the real Tudor world lived, not in the official histories or portraits, but in ink that trembled across the page, written by candlelight and conscience. Most of these diaries were never meant to be read. They were confessions, little prayers made to paper. A place where a woman could admit what no priest would forgive, and no husband would understand. One such voice belonged to Lady Margaret Hoby, whose diary, begun in the 1590s, is one of the earliest written by an Englishwoman. Her words move between devotion and doubt, the rhythm of prayer interrupted by the small ache of daily life. She writes of servants, illnesses, and her constant struggle to live rightly. Yet beneath her piety lies something very human: exhaustion, yearning, the sense of being unseen. Her diary was not rebellion, but revelation. For the first time, a woman's inner life, her private fears and quiet hopes, became a subject worth writing about. And soon, others followed. Some women recorded dreams, believing they were messages from heaven. Others wrote love letters never sent. A few kept detailed notes of their pregnancies, miscarriages, and griefs, the kinds of stories that history usually ignores. Through their ink, they made invisible lives visible. Even women who couldn't write found ways to record themselves. They embroidered their initials on linen, carved hearts into pews, pressed flowers between pages of psalters. Each act whispered the same truth: I was here. I lived. It was in these small acts of self-preservation that individuality, that quietly radical idea, took root. The Tudor woman, once expected only to obey and endure, began to define herself on her own terms. She became the author of her own interior world. Loneliness, too, shaped these pages. For while courtly life glittered with company, true companionship was rare. Friendships were fragile, marriages were alliances, and most letters ended with a subtle question: "Do you still think of me?" Even queens were not immune. Elizabeth I wrote to her confidants with the weary affection of a soul forever performing. She spoke often of duty, but between her words lay a profound solitude. Power, it seemed, was the most isolating luxury of all. In the quiet ink of Tudor women's diaries, love and loneliness intertwined, one giving meaning to the other. And through their solitude, they created something entirely new, a sense of the self that existed beyond obedience, beyond expectation, beyond gaze. It was the first flicker of modern identity, fragile, luminous, alive. But while women discovered their voices in private, the public world beyond them was changing fast. England was shifting, restless, trade expanding, the New World calling, and with it came a new wave of curiosity that would challenge everything the Tudors thought they knew. And as the tides of empire began to rise, the question emerged: what would become of the women who stayed behind? As England's ships set sail across uncharted seas, carrying adventurers, merchants, and dreamers, another kind of courage unfolded quietly at home. The courage of waiting, of surviving absence, of making a life out of uncertainty. For every man who crossed the Atlantic or vanished into the fog of foreign ports, there was a woman who stood at a doorway, watching the horizon. She might be a wife, a sister, a mother, or a widow who did not yet know she was one. The Tudor age was not kind to the waiting woman. Letters took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Rumors traveled faster than ships. Some women received word of shipwrecks years after the fact. Others never received word at all. Still, they endured. But endurance did not mean passivity. Many women learned to manage estates in their husband's absence. They handled debts, harvests, servants, and lawsuits. They became businesswomen by necessity, and often by brilliance. Grace O'Malley, the so-called pirate queen of Ireland, commanded ships of her own, negotiating directly with Elizabeth I. She was everything Tudor propriety forbade: fierce, free, untamed by any man. Yet even she wrote letters of pleading and strategy, her words a mixture of ferocity and diplomacy. Not all who stayed behind lived such dramatic lives, but each, in her own way, mastered survival. They formed quiet communities of women, sharing tools, recipes, remedies, and gossip. Through their kitchens and gatherings, they built an invisible web of strength that stretched across villages and manors alike. And within that web grew something radical: empathy. They began to see one another not as rivals for favor, but as allies in endurance. When the explorers returned, changed, hardened, half mythic, they found their homes changed, too. The women they left behind were no longer waiting girls but capable figures who had learned to command. Some men were threatened by this transformation. Others admired it. But either way, England itself had shifted. Its women were no longer silent fixtures in portraits. They were living, thinking, managing forces in the story of empire. Even so, the price of strength was often solitude. For every woman who gained respect, another was whispered about, accused of overstepping her place. The line between competence and scandal remained perilously thin. And as the century turned, and Elizabeth grew older, her court began to see in her aging face the reflection of its own mortality. The golden age was dimming. And with it, the last embers of Tudor grandeur began to fade. But not before one last, luminous act, the farewell of a queen, and the quiet legacy of all the women who had lived beneath her shadow. By the winter of 1602, the once mirrored brilliance of Queen Elizabeth I had dimmed. Her hair, once red as foxglove, was now a brittle halo of false curls. Her gowns, still magnificent, still pearl-bound, hung loosely on a frame worn by time. And yet, even in her frailty, she remained magnificent, like an old cathedral whose stones still echo with prayer. The Queen's chambers were quieter now. The laughter of courtiers had faded, replaced by whispers, then by silence. The air smelled of wax and lavender, and the ticking of a small clock marked the slow unraveling of her days. Elizabeth no longer danced. She no longer adorned herself with the jewels of conquest or the medals of victory. Instead, she sat by the fire, her thoughts drifting backward to the bright, dangerous youth of her reign. She saw in Bullen's dark eyes in her own reflection, and sometimes she murmured her mother's name. She remembered the women who had surrounded her, some loyal, some lost to intrigue, some forgotten entirely. Each had played their part in the grand performance of Tudor life, and now their ghosts came quietly to keep her company. At night they stood around her in the flickering candlelight, not specters of guilt, but echoes of memory. Catherine Parr, reading softly by the window. Mary Sidney, her ink-stained fingers folded in prayer. Bess of Hardwick, draped in velvet and determination. Even the laughing Catherine Howard, whose youth had burned too brightly to last. Elizabeth would smile faintly, as if seeing them again. These were not merely women she had known, they were the century itself, embodied in silk and sorrow, ambition and grace. Her courtiers, frightened by her melancholy, begged her to rest. But she refused the bed, saying only, "Little by little, I must become earth." And so she remained standing, silent, regal to the end, her strength the last act of a queen who had built herself from contradictions, woman and monarch, virgin and mother, ruler and prisoner of her own myth. On the final night, she did not call for priests or physicians. She called for silence. And in that silence, her mind wandered through decades of rule, the poets she had inspired, the lovers she had denied, the wars she had survived, the faces that had faded like ink on vellum. When she finally closed her eyes, it was said her lips curved as if at some secret thought. Perhaps she was seeing not heaven or angels, but the long procession of Tudor women walking toward her, the ones history forgot, now gathered in one luminous crowd. And as dawn broke over Richmond Palace, a new sun rose over a changed world. The Tudor age had ended, but its women, bold, silent, scandalous, brilliant, had already written themselves into its soul. Their stories, whispered through centuries of dust and parchment, would outlive crowns. When the Tudor dynasty breathed its last, England awoke into a quieter, stranger morning. The pageantry dimmed, the music softened, and the rules began to shift. But the women of that vanished century, the ones who stitched, wrote, wept, plotted, and endured, had left a residue too deep to erase. They had been daughters of obedience and mothers of defiance. They had stood in the shadow of kings and learned to bend light back toward themselves. Their influence rippled through generations unseen, in the education of daughters, in the gentle art of letter writing, in the courage to question, even softly. No longer confined to the margins, women's voices began to seep into every corner of life. They became teachers, translators, poets. They held salons, ran estates, and shaped households not merely as caretakers but as custodians of culture. The seed of selfhood, planted in those secret diaries and dangerous flirtations, began to grow. By the early 17th century, the quiet rebellion of the Tudor woman had become something else entirely, a philosophy. A belief that the mind, no matter its gender, deserved to speak. Men still wrote laws and sermons, but now they did so in a world shaped by women who had learned the art of endurance. Women who had taught generations that dignity could exist even in disobedience, and that virtue could coexist with desire. The Tudor era was gone, but its ghost lingered in the cadence of the English language, in the scent of roses and wax, in the delicate contradiction of being both bound and free. And in every household where a woman lifted a quill, or defied a custom, or simply chose to think for herself, the echoes of that age could still be heard. A faint music, the rhythm of silks and whispers, playing softly through time. History rarely ends, it ripples. And though the Tudor century had closed its doors, the echo of its women, their wit, their hunger, their defiance, continued to vibrate through time like a lingering chord from a forgotten hymn. Their voices survived not through monuments or royal decrees, but through the quieter relics of memory, a line of verse copied into a psalter, a pressed flower between pages, a rumor of courage passed from mother to daughter. By the 17th century, England was restless again, a land between faiths, between monarchs, between certainties. And in the drawing rooms and bookshops of London, women began to claim a new kind of inheritance. They read the poetry of Mary Sidney, the plays of Elizabeth Carey, and the verses of Emilia Lanier, who dared to praise Eve not as the first sinner, but as the first seeker of knowledge. Lanier's Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum was more than a poem, it was an argument, a reclamation. In its lines, one could still hear the pulse of those Tudor women who had whispered their truths in secret. The ink of rebellion had begun to flow, elegantly, quietly, unstoppably. Even the act of writing, of sitting down, quill in hand, had become a symbol of resistance. Every woman who wrote her thoughts was rewriting the terms of her own existence. The salons of Europe, inspired by such examples, began to fill with female thinkers. In France, they debated philosophy. In England, they translated scripture. In Italy, they composed sonnets that shimmered like stained glass. And though centuries divided them from the Tudors, each carried that same spark, the courage to be seen. The rebellion of ink was not noisy, nor immediate. It was a slow burn, a candle passed through generations, its light fragile yet immortal. In time, this flicker would illuminate far grander revolutions. Women demanding education, property, voice, vote. But its roots were here, in the private letters of queens and the secret notebooks of courtiers. What began as whispered longing beneath Tudor ceilings became, over centuries, a chorus of clarity. A declaration that intellect and femininity need not be enemies, that passion and piety could share the same pulse. So even as the world changed, the wigs grew higher, the corsets tighter, the politics louder, the foundation remained, women writing themselves into existence. And still, in every age that followed, some returned to the Tudor ghosts for guidance, to Anne Boleyn's daring, Elizabeth's solitude, Mary Sidney's eloquence. Their legacies had become myth, but myths, after all, are the bones of truth. Their ink still glimmers in our own. And through it, the rebellion continues. The Tudor world is gone, its castles softened by moss, its portraits faded to shadows. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint rustle of skirts in the corridors of history. Somewhere, a woman is still whispering, her words trapped in the folds of time. Most of their names were never recorded. The washerwomen, midwives, scribes, and servants, those who lived not in the court but in its echo. They carried water, clean ink from parchment, and nursed infants who would grow to inherit titles they themselves could never touch. They were invisible, yet indispensable. And though history forgot them, the world they built endures in quieter ways, in the rhythms of domestic life, in the recipes that survived, and the lullabies still sung without knowing their origins. For it was these women, not queens or courtesans, who kept England alive. They were the keepers of the ordinary, and the ordinary, sustained long enough, becomes extraordinary. They passed stories by the hearth, not the throne. They kept diaries in their memories, not on paper. And sometimes, when the wind moves through an old Tudor house, you might swear you can hear their laughter in the rafters. To remember them is to complete the story. Because the grandeur of the Tudors, their golden portraits and tragic romances, rests upon the quiet labor of those whose names we'll never know. Every crown was polished by unseen hands. Every letter delivered by someone unthanked. Every law written by torchlight depended on the one who trimmed the wick. History loves its queens and scandals, but the real soul of an age lives in the anonymous. In the woman who sang as she scrubbed the floor, in the widow who taught her son to read, in the servant who copied her mistress's verses by heart. And so, in the long echo of Tudor England, these forgotten women are still there. Invisible threads, holding everything together. The candle of their memory has never gone out. It burns softly still, lighting the way back to a time when even silence had meaning. But before the story ends, one last question remains. What, after all, did decency ever truly mean? Decency. The word once weighed heavier than any law. In Tudor England, it was not simply about virtue or modesty. It was theater. It was armor. It was survival. To be decent was to perform, to know when to curtsy, when to look down, when to speak and when to feign ignorance. It was not truth that ruled courtly life, but choreography. And those who forgot their lines often paid dearly. Every Tudor woman, whether queen or milkmaid, lived beneath this silent demand: behave as the world expects, not as you are. The court of Henry VIII, with its silks and scandals, perfected this illusion. Men flaunted chivalry as disguise, women crafted demureness as a weapon. Beneath every gentle bow and murmured prayer hid something raw: ambition, lust, wit, hunger. Elizabeth I understood this best. She cloaked her authority in virginity, knowing the title of the Virgin Queen disarmed men who could not imagine power unwed. She let them call her pure, even as she ruled with the precision of a blade. It was performance elevated to art, the manipulation of perception itself. Decency, then, was not a moral compass. It was a mask the world required women to wear. And yet, within that mask, some learned to smile in secret. Ladies of the court wrote verses hidden in psalm books. Wives found solace in coded letters, where metaphors of gardens and mirrors disguised forbidden thought. Decency demanded silence, but silence became its own kind of language. You could see it even in fashion. Layers upon layers of cloth, sleeves ballooned with linen, collars reaching like fortresses around the neck. The body was erased, yet in that very erasure, women found power. They controlled what was seen, and what remained theirs alone. In a sense, Tudor decency was the world's first great performance of hypocrisy. But from within its suffocating rituals came rebellion, slow, subtle, relentless. The women who once whispered behind their fans would one day speak through books, through salons, through pulpits and parliaments. And the irony? All that pretense, all that rigid decency, became the perfect stage for defiance to grow. For beneath every rule lies its undoing. And beneath every silence, an untold story waiting to breathe. So when we say Tudor women broke the rules of decency, what we mean is this. They learned to turn the cage into a mirror. To reflect power back, elegantly, fatally, beautifully. They did not shatter the mask. They simply learned to wear it better than those who made it. And perhaps that is the truest rebellion of all. And so we arrive at the quiet end, where candles burn low, and the last echoes of the Tudor court dissolve into the soft hum of time. Centuries have passed since those women lived, danced, plotted, prayed. The gowns have turned to dust. The letters have yellowed. But the questions they raised, about power, identity, desire, still murmur beneath our own lives. In their world, freedom was not declared, it was imagined. A glance held too long, a letter sent in secret, a poem written under moonlight, these were acts of quiet revolution. And though history often forgets the smallness of such gestures, it is small gestures that survive longest. Because rebellion, when whispered often enough, becomes tradition. Look closely at our own time. We still chase the illusion of decency, the curated image, the performance of virtue, the need to appear acceptable before the unseen audience of society. And yet, the spirit of those Tudor women lingers, urging us to see beyond the stage. They remind us that true decency is not silence or obedience, but honesty. The courage to exist fully, even when the world demands restraint. The Tudors, for all their glitter and violence, gave birth to something strange and enduring. A lineage of women unafraid to think, to question, to create. They lived in the shadows of kings, but history, if you listen closely, is written in their footsteps. And now, as night deepens and the ink dries on this final page, imagine them. Not as ghosts, but as companions. Walking with you through the corridors of time, whispering, laughing softly at the idea that anyone could ever define decency for them. They were not saints. They were not villains. They were human, brilliantly, dangerously, beautifully human. And perhaps that is the greatest rule they ever broke. So, if you're listening now, perhaps late at night, with the world quiet around you, remember that history is not asleep. It dreams through us. And every time you choose to live honestly, or to speak a truth softly but surely, you are finishing the story they began. Good night. And may the past rest gently beside you.